Hey everybody, welcome to Board Online, Board Offline. Today we are going to be teaching you how to play Dungeon Universalis. This is the fourth part of our instructional series, and we will be covering everything in the rulebook about combat and magic. So this is roughly in the rulebook, pages 30 to 44 if you're looking for references to the rules. So let's get right into it and teach you how to play Dungeon Universalis. Combat takes place during what's known as a combat turn. If there's an enemy located within 12 squares or less from the character, then that character or that group of heroes would be considered to be in a combat turn. So in this case, our hero here is in a combat turn with this skeleton, while this hero over here is not, and this hero would be known as being in an exploration turn. It should also be noted that if all enemies are eliminated in the same turn and there are still heroes that need to be activated, they will be able to perform their activation, but they're no longer in combat. As soon as a hero reveals an unexplored section and enemies are spawned into it, an initiative opposed roll takes place. The initiative roll is made using the perception attribute of the character closest to any of the enemies that have just been revealed. So the hero rolls 2d6 plus their perception, as does the enemy. If there is a tie, the winner goes to the one with the highest intelligence. If there is still a tie, a new roll must be made. Also, a double 6 is always considered a success, unless, of course, both contenders roll a double 6. If the hero wins the initiative roll, a new turn for them will begin immediately. This means the dark player will not be able to draw cards or add achievements. If the heroes lose the initiative roll, the turn ends for them immediately and the dark player turn begins. It should be noted that initiative rolls don't just have to occur when a new area is revealed. If the dark player spawns in an enemy when combat was not already in place, then initiative rolls will take place at that point. If two characters from the hero side or two characters from the dark player side are tied for being the closest character, the character with the highest perception will roll for initiative. If they have the same initiative, then randomly determine which one will roll. As soon as the initiative roll is made, enemies 6 or less squares away from the character or creature that won the initiative will be affected by the caught by surprise rule. So let's say in this case, the heroes won the initiative. This hero is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 spaces away. And so this enemy will be affected by the caught by surprise rule. As soon as the initiative roll is made, enemies that are 6 or less squares away from the character or creature that won the initiative test will be affected by the caught by surprise rule if both dice rolled by the winning side equal or exceed their intelligence. So, if this enemy's intelligence were a 1, 2, or a 3, then they would be affected by caught by surprise since these dice are 4. However, it should be noted that if one of the dice rolled is a 1, it does not matter if they won the initiative, the enemy cannot be caught by surprise. The characters affected by caught by surprise can be moved by the winner, and their facing can be chosen as well. They can be moved to an adjacent square free of obstacles or characters. It should be noted that characters and creatures will never be affected by this rule if the new section was revealed after breaking down the access door. That noise prevents them from being caught by surprise. Also, if one of the sides ends up with a critical failure, meaning they rolled double 1s, all characters on that side within 6 squares of the hero will automatically be affected by caught by surprise. It should also be noted that caught by surprise can never be applied to a side that's already in a combat turn. Now let's discuss line of sight and cover. A character must be able to see their enemy at some point during their activation in order to target them. In order to determine if a character has line of sight to another character, you will draw an imaginary straight line from the center of the character's square to the center of the target square. If one of the characters takes up more than one square, as one using this base would, you simply choose the center of one of the squares it occupies. As long as there are no elements obstructing the line, then there will be clear line of sight. However, the character must be facing their target. If a character is not facing their target, there can be no line of sight to the target. Also, no creature can have line of sight through elements of the same height or higher than themselves. So if this furniture here were the same height or higher than our dwarf, then he would not have line of sight to the enemy. The exception is in those cases in which the target is higher than the interposing element or the target is in an elevated position. So let's say that this furniture is shorter than this enemy. So the dwarf will be able to attack that enemy. However, since the enemy is adjacent to this furniture, he receives cover. Cover can be applied in this way even if the drawn line touches only a corner of the square occupied by the element. In order to have cover, the target must always be adjacent to the obstacle. Depending on the nature of the element providing cover, it will either be light or heavy cover. So light cover would be tables, chairs, fences, other wooden furniture such as that, while heavy would be something such as a wall, a column, a statue, etc. If either of these characters had flying for any reason, they would automatically be considered to be higher than the other characters that are not flying around them. And when flying characters are targeted, they are considered to be flying at a height of 4. Therefore, all characters have line of sight to a target that is flying unless that line of sight is blocked by an impassable obstacle. With regards to facing, any of the squares along this line and forward are considered in front of him, and these squares would be behind him. If the character had diagonal facing like this, so let's say they're facing down this diagonal path here, then these squares and farther back are behind him, while these squares and this way are in front of him. Every character exercises a zone of influence on each of its adjacent squares, of course including diagonals. We call this the character's melee range. If a character is running, they may not move through any squares adjacent to another enemy, even if that enemy cannot engage them. Any character who does enter a square which is part of an enemy's melee range must end their movement there. Then both characters are considered to be engaged. Anytime characters are within the melee range of an enemy, they are engaged with that enemy. Now, assuming a character is not running, they can enter the melee range of an enemy without becoming engaged under 3 specific situations. Assuming that this character is taller than this character, then this character can enter the melee range of the smaller character without becoming engaged. If this character is already within melee range of another character of equal or greater height, then this one can enter the melee range without becoming engaged. Or this character is adjacent to 2 or more allies of this character whose size is 1 level smaller than their own, then they can move without becoming engaged. So to recap, a character can only be engaged by other characters of the same size or higher, or by 2 or more adjacent enemies of an immediately lower size. And if you ever have a situation where creatures or characters are near an enemy of a much smaller size, they will ignore their melee range regardless of how many are adjacent. A much smaller size is considered to be at least 2 levels in height or size between them. If a character is engaged with an opponent, they can move to an adjacent square without disengaging as long as that square is within the opponent's melee range. An engaged character can disengage from an opponent's melee range and move normally if they pass an agility test. They must do this before they perform the action. If they fail, they will remain engaged with the enemy, and their activation will be over. If they critically fail the test, they will be automatically hit by the opponent. And if they wish to disengage from several enemies, they will need to pass an agility test for each of them. If a character attacks an enemy from behind, they will get a bonus to hit. We'll cover these modifiers in the ranged attack and melee combat sections of this video, but I just wanted to point this out ahead of time since we're already talking about facing. Additionally, the defending character will not be able to use their shield if they have one. Multiple attacks are also possible. If an attacker can perform several attacks, these will be resolved separately. A maximum of 3 attacks can be made by a single character or creature, regardless of the combination of weapons or skills they're using. It is possible that during the course of an action, a character may be pushed, or the character may push an enemy. In these cases, they may not be able to perform some of their actions because they have exhausted their movement and aren't adjacent to the enemy anymore. When this happens, momentum allows them to advance a single space to complete their action. Now let's discuss ranged attacks. Ranged attacks must be carried out with a ranged weapon, as you might expect. That can be either a projectile or a throwing weapon. The targets must be located within the weapon's range, and the target must be located within the weapon's range. It's also important to keep in mind that you cannot make a ranged attack while you are within an enemy's melee range, or while adjacent to an enemy. Range is counted simply by counting the squares from your hero to the target. And so if this is our hero here, then the range to this target would be 1, 2, 3. In order to achieve a hit with a ranged attack, a character will have to pass a shooting skill test. In other words, roll 2d6 and add the results to the shooting skill found here. In this case, it's 5. And if the result is 10 or higher, you have succeeded at the shooting skill test. A blunder or critical failure, meaning double ones, when attacking with a ranged attack may result in the weapon breaking. We'll discuss breaking rolls during the damage and conditions portion of this video. Additionally, the ranged attack will automatically hit the closest ally among those adjacent to the squares through which the path of the shot passed. So, if an ally were over here, they would be safe from getting hit by the errant shot. But if the ally were here, as you can see, the shot would have gone 1, 2, 3. And so this ally would have been hit due to the critical failure. If there are multiple allies located the same distance from the trajectory, one random character will be hit. It should also be noted that a critical failure results in the end of the character's activation. If the shooting test fails and there is a result of 1 on one of the dice, if there is an ally adjacent to the enemy, then that ally will be hit by the shot. In this case, the ally must be the same height or taller than the enemy. If the ally is shorter than the enemy, they cannot be hit by this errant shot. It should also be noted that if the character uses a magic arrow or a throwing weapon, they cannot use that weapon again until the end of combat, unless, of course, the weapon has some sort of feature where it returns to the character. Shooting at a character behind light cover has a penalty of -1. If this were heavy cover, the penalty would be -2. There are several distance modifiers to take into account. Range attacks against targets from point-blank range, which is considered up to 3 squares, so this is point-blank range, will not be penalized. A short distance is considered to be between 4 and 6 squares. In this case, the range attack receives a penalty of -1. A medium distance is considered 7 to 9 squares, and in that case, the penalty is -2. Long distance is 10 squares up to the maximum range of the weapon, and in that case, the penalty is -3. Also, if a target is more than half the maximum range of the weapon, not including throwing weapons, critical results will not generate extra damage. Now, that sounds like a lot, but keep in mind that it is in multiples of 3 to make it easy to remember. So 3 or less is point blank, 6 to 4 is short range, 9 to 7 is medium range, and 10 plus is long range. There are some more modifiers to take into account. If the target is small, the shooter will get a -1 to their shooting skill. If the target is small, the shooter will get a -1. If the target is large or huge, the shooter will get +1. If the target is designated as stationary, the shooter will get +2. If the shooter moves up to half their movement, they receive a -1 penalty. If they move more than half their movement, they receive a -2 penalty. An exception to this rule is if the shooter is using a throwing weapon and they move only 1 or 2 squares, then there is no penalty. If the target creature is flying this turn, the shooter receives -1. If the target's agility is more than the shooter's agility, the shooter receives -1. If the shooter is attacking from behind the target or the target is knocked down, the shooter receives +1. Also, the defender will not be able to use their shield. The shooter must be behind the target for their entire turn. Any movement that occurs by the shooter prior to the attack must also have occurred behind the target. The shooter must never be in the target's line of sight to receive the +1. If the shooter is standing on any terrain that is designated difficult, they will receive a -1. And finally, let's discuss defensive shots. A character armed with a ranged weapon will be able to react using a defensive shot against an enemy who moves with the intention of attacking, engaging, or flying through their melee zone. So if this enemy was moving in with the intention to engage our hero here, they could use a defensive shot. One key piece to keep in mind here is that the move of the enemy must be initiated in a square with which our hero has line of sight. Defensive shots receive a -2 penalty. Also, if the target starts their movement in a position 2 squares or fewer away from the character, a defensive shot will not be allowed. The target of the defensive shot must stop their movement when they are 3 squares away, which means that in this case, the moment this enemy decides to move towards our character, they would have to stop here since they were already 3 squares away. At that moment, when they stop 3 squares away, the defensive shot occurs. If the shot hits and causes at least 1 wound, the target will stop their advance. To be clear, that is for medium, which this is, or small enemies. If the enemy is large or huge, they will only stop their advance if 2 6s are rolled. As you might expect, defensive shots cannot be fired if the weapon is in the reloading position. Also, a character may not make a defensive shot more than once per turn. Now let's discuss melee combat. Characters can attack adjacent enemies located in the front of their melee range. Attacker and defender must roll 2d6. This is an opposed roll, and then they add their respective combat skill attributes. The character who gets the highest result, including all modifiers, wins the combat round. If the defender wins, the attack simply did not succeed. If the attacker wins, he will hit his target and will roll the damage dice. So, if our hero rolled a 3 and the enemy rolled a 6, they would then add their combat. So the enemy has 3, so they rolled a 9. Borgren has 4, so they rolled a 7. And the enemy has won this roll. So the attack fails. As usual, a double 6 is always a success regardless of what the opposing roll is. Now, in the case of a tie, so let's say the skeleton rolls a total of 9, as does Borgren, then the character with the highest agility wins the roll. Borgren has 3 agility, the skeleton has 1 agility, and so Borgren would win. If they had the same agility, if there was still a tie after comparing agility, then the winner will be the one who uses a shield. If both use a shield, then the defender always wins. In the case of a critical failure, the weapon used will immediately fall on the ground. it will be in the same square currently occupied by the opponent. A breaking roll must also be made to determine whether the weapon breaks. Again, we'll discuss breaking rolls near the end of the video. You will use a marker such as this to indicate where the weapon currently is. This means the character who blundered will be momentarily disarmed until they can pick up their weapon or draw another weapon. To pick up a weapon, it must be located in an adjacent square or the same square occupied by the character who wants to pick it up. And picking it up is a quick action. However, if the weapon is within melee range of an enemy, as it obviously is right now since the enemy is standing on top of it, the character must use a full action to try to pass an agility test. So, in this case, agility is 3, need to get higher than a 10. And so in this case, the agility test was passed. But remember, this would have occurred on a different turn than when Borgren dropped it, because a critical failure during a character's turn results in the end of their activation. If the attacker wins the hitting roll against an opponent of the same size or smaller, they may push them back to an empty adjacent square, and this may even be diagonally, after resolving the damage roll, of course. The push player maintains their facing. If for any reason there were no empty squares adjacent, then they could not be pushed and will maintain their place. If, however, they cannot be pushed due to impassable terrain, such as a wall, the library, a column, etc., they will take 1 extra damage die from the same attack. A push character will fall. A character will fall if there is a difference in height in the square where they are pushed, if there's a pit, precipice, or obstacle existing in that square where they're pushed. However, the character will only fall into the pit or off a cliff if there are no other empty squares where they could be pushed. When an attacker succeeds in eliminating an enemy, or if the attacker succeeds in pushing the enemy or knocking them down, they may occupy the square abandoned by the defender. This is only in the case of a melee weapon attack, not in a ranged weapon attack situation. Occupying the space abandoned by the enemy is not considered a move, and their facing can be changed as desired. Now let's discuss some modifiers. Some weapons have penalties when used for attacking. For instance, the battle axe here shows -1 to the user's attack. This represents how difficult it is to use each weapon in a specific situation. It is possible to have cover during a melee attack. For instance, let's say this skeleton is here and Borgren is here. Because the melee attack is made diagonally with the corner of a wall blocking the path, the attacker will receive a -1 penalty to their roll. Light or heavy cover is not taken into account for melee attacks like this. Another example would be if the skeleton were attacking with a spear across this bed. In that case, the skeleton would also receive a -1 penalty. A character attacking a flying target will have a -1 penalty. And if a flying character or creature wants to attack in melee an enemy on the ground, they must stop flying to do so. If attacking from an elevated position, such as this raised platform here, they will get a +1 to their combat skill. If attacking from an elevated position, such as this hero attacking the skeleton, they will receive a +1 combat skill. If attacking from the rear, or if the target is knocked down, the attacker receives +1 to their combat skill, and the defender cannot use their shield. Just as with ranged attack, all movement prior to the attack must be done behind the enemy out of their line of sight. If the attacking character is located on difficult terrain, they receive -1 to their combat skill. Attacks against stationary targets such as doors, furniture, etc., will not require a hitting roll and automatically hit. If there is a character who has been designated as stationary, they will have their armor reduced by 1. Let's say a character's weapon has been lost, it's on the ground, and they're going to use a quick action in order to draw a weapon while within an enemy's melee range. In that case, they get a -1 to their combat skill. If a character is using a long-range melee weapon, meaning a melee weapon that can attack from 2 squares away, they receive a -1 penalty when attacking adjacent enemies with it. If a character is unarmed, they have -1 to their combat skill, and they will roll as many damage dice as their strength. Additionally, their target's armor will increase by 1. If a character is armed with a ranged weapon and they're in melee, then they will be considered unarmed during combat. Magic is only available to spellcasters who can learn different spells according to their class and the lore of magic they chose. At the same time, each lore belongs to a great magic realm depending on the type of gods that are venerated. The gods of elements have air, earth, fire, and water. The gods of light and harmony have blessings, light, music, and runic. The gods of darkness have corruption, necromancy, underworld, and witchcraft. And the gods of nature have animism, channeling, nature, and tribal. Each spellcaster has 2 mana for each spell learned. So in this case, 4 mana. A hero's mana pool can never exceed their intelligence times 3. So in this case, intelligence of 4 times 3 is 12. Spells, depending on their duration, can be of 2 types, immediate or permanent. Immediate effect spells are resolved in the turn in which they are cast, and their effects disappear after that turn. But permanent spells last for the determined number of turns. Each of these spells are immediate, as there is no icon in this section here. However, something such as the tribal spell War Dance has this icon here indicating it is a permanent spell, and its permanence will be determined by a roll. A spellcaster can use an action to cast a spell as long as they have at least 1 free hand. To cast a spell, they will have to pass an intelligence check. As you can see here, we rolled a 6, intelligence is 4, 6 plus 4 is 10, and so we passed. If successful, the effects of the spell will be resolved, and the spellcaster will then remove the number of mana markers required for the spell. In the case of Blast of Light and Healing Light, it requires 1 mana, and they will place that mana on the spell card itself. This is important as every spell has a limit of being cast 3 times during a single quest. There are mana potions, which, in addition to recovering mana points, allow the wizard to remove 1 mana marker placed on the card of a particular spell they have already cast. If the spell is a permanent spell, again, as War Dance is, it will last a number of turns equal to the highest die rolled during the intelligence test. So, in this roll, it would last 4 turns. Take the highest die, place it on the card, and use that to count down the turns that the spell is remaining. After the final turn, the spell's effect will finish. A new spell may be cast by the same character while one is currently active, but in that case, the caster will receive a -1 penalty. If the caster of the permanent spell is knocked out, the spell is immediately finished. 2 permanent spells cannot be cast at the same time. If a spellcaster did cast a second permanent spell, the effects of the first spell would disappear. Also, spellcasters can choose to stop the effects of a permanent spell at any time during their activation. Spellcasters may only use 1 magic scroll or components for magic per turn. There are 2 types of spells according to the consumption of mana: basic spells and superior spells. Basic spells consume 1 mana point for each successful cast, while superior spells require 2 or sometimes more mana points and cannot be combined with a move in the same turn. Spells require a line of sight to their target, and cover will only be taken into account in the case of magic projectiles. Line of sight and cover are handled in spellcasting just as they are in ranged attacks. As soon as a spell is successfully cast, a spellcaster on the opposing side can immediately declare they will try to dispel it before its effects are resolved. Such dispelling requires an intelligence test on the part of the dispelling caster, and that must exceed the total result, with which the spell was cast. And so in many ways, it is actually an opposed intelligence roll. So for instance, let's say for this example, this Goblin Bandit was actually a special named enemy who was a magic caster. So for this example, let's say this Goblin Bandit was a special named enemy who had the ability to dispel magic. And this is the roll that our hero used to cast a spell. You can see that his roll is 12 using his intelligence. The Goblin Bandit attempts to dispel it and rolls a 12 as well. And so now we have a tie. In the case of dispelling, the roll must exceed the total result, and so this dispel attempt fails. If dispelling is successful, though, maybe he rolled this instead, the spell will have no effect, but it will still consume the necessary mana. Spells cannot be dispelled while within an enemy's melee range, and successful dispelling requires the spending of a single mana point. The character has no mana, they cannot dispel. Additionally, in order to dispel a spell, the dispelling character must be 8 squares or fewer away from either the caster or the target. If the spellcaster rolls double 6s, then it is impossible to dispel the spell. Additionally, each roll of 6 while casting spells that require rolling for damage will be regarded as a critical and will deal extra damage. We'll discuss that in more detail during the damage and conditions portion of this video. A critical fail, a double 1, a blunder, while attempting to cast a spell will cause a spell not to be cast at all, but the mana, again, is still consumed. Additionally, any components for magic or magic scrolls used will be consumed as well. Additionally, the spellcaster will be automatically stunned and will roll 5d6. For each result that equals or exceeds their intelligence, in this case we have 1, the 5 right here, they will lose 1 vitality. This is considered to have been received from the spell and will ignore skills such as invulnerable. And as always, the critical failure means the end of the character's activation. Let's take a quick look at exactly what you'll find on a spell card. In the top left corner, you have the nature of the spell. This represents each of the 6 types of spells according to their nature. Here you have the area of effect, which may have a value of 1, 2, 3, etc. If there is no symbol, it means that it only affects the target character or square and therefore has no area of effect. An AoE spell will affect the squares located within a radius of the same number of squares counting from the selected target. If the spell only affects allies or enemies, it will be specified on the card, which is the maximum distance expressed in squares at which the target is eligible for the spell. This target can be either a square or a character. If it has a range of 1, it means it can only be cast on an adjacent target. If you see this symbol here, that indicates the distance from the caster the target can be. The symbol on this card indicates that the caster can only cast it on themselves. Or if you see it like this, then that means it can be cast on the caster or at the distance indicated. And remember, in the case of AoE spells, the target is who dictates where the spell emanates from. Down here, we have a description of the effects of the spell. We have the mana cost up here. If it is a permanent effect, you'll see this symbol here. The learning cost is found here. This is expressed in coins. It's the cost of learning the spell at the appropriate place, usually at a school of magic. And on the back of the card, you have the lore of magic. We mentioned the 6 natures of spells, and as we said, that's determined by this symbol in the top left corner. And so just very quickly, this symbol indicates a magic projectile. To cast one of these, you'll draw a straight line as you do when firing a ranged weapon. Many of these will have an AoE effect as well, and any character caught in the AoE will suffer 2 less damage dice than the target itself. Characters who benefit from light cover will take 1 less damage die than the spell indicates, and those who benefit from heavy cover will take 2 less dice damage. This is a control spell. These are used to control the will of creatures and enemies, stun them, immobilize them, or affect their movement and skills. Control spells only affect large or huge creatures and champion creatures if a critical result was rolled. This is a damage spell. These are not projectiles, but are used to cause some type of damage to enemies and reduce their vitality. This is a protecting spell. It's used to protect allies or the caster. These are enhancing spells, which are used to give bonuses or boost skills and attributes of allies or the caster. And these are healing spells, which of course are used to heal allies and remove conditions. If a large or huge creature is designated as the target of a magic projectile that also affects adjacent squares, those adjacent squares, if occupied by this large or huge creature, will not receive extra damage. Meaning that if you fire these ice arrows at this square, they say on here that they will affect adjacent squares, but the adjacent squares occupied by this creature will not receive additional damage. Once a target is hit, either by a ranged shot or a melee combat, or by successfully casting a spell, a damage roll must be made. Each weapon includes information about the damage roll. Right here. So in this case, you can see that the damage dice for the battle axe is the user's strength plus 2. So if we were talking about our warrior monk here, the strength is 3. So the damage dice roll would be 5. Each damage die will cause 1 wound to the target if it equals or exceeds the target's armor. So in this case, we have an armor of 4. And we roll. And we have 1 wound right here. And 1 wound right here for a total of 2 wounds. Any 1 that's rolled is always a failure regardless of modifiers. Also, it should be noted that a character will always roll at least 1 die, even if modifiers would have them rolling 0 dice. However, if the modifiers would have them roll 0 dice, they will, as I said, roll the 1, but the enemy's armor will be increased by 1. Also, during the roll to determine if the monster is hit, every crit means 1 additional damage die will be rolled. The maximum armor attribute can be, after modifiers, is 6. However, when trying to wound a target with an armor of 6 using a weapon that actually increases their armor by 1, you must roll for damage as usual. If you roll a 6, you then will roll again. If there are any 6s in the roll, you will then roll those dice again, and if any of them are 6s, then that one has wounded. Weapons can be broken when the attacker or defender gets a crit fail while using them. In that case, the character must roll 1d6. If the result matches what's in this box here, then the weapon is broken and becomes useless. So in this case, the battle axe would have been broken. Now we're going to talk a little bit about conditions, but I do want to point out this chart on page 42. Now, once you get used to exactly what this chart's saying, it's going to become relatively intuitive and you'll be able to remember without looking at this chart. But essentially, a much larger attacker will always knock down their enemy with a normal, a critical, or a double crit. A larger attacker will have no additional effect, I should say, with a normal success with an attack, but on a critical success or a double crit, they will knock down their enemy. If they are the same size, only a double crit will knock down the enemy. If the attacker is smaller, there's no effect for normal or crit, but a double crit will still stun them, and a much smaller attacker will stun on a double crit as well. As soon as a character or creature is knocked down, it will be placed lying face up. Knockdown characters get a -1 penalty to all their attributes other than natural armor, mana, and vitality. They don't block line of sight, and they don't have a melee range. They cannot move. They cannot perform any actions or push while affected in this condition. However, they can still defend and dispel. Also, if they have access to any active skills that are used as reactions to attacks, they can use those. The knockdown condition lasts until they stand up during the recovery phase. A stunned character gets a -1 penalty to all of their attributes except natural armor, mana, and vitality. They also cannot run. Stunned can last indefinitely, but it may be canceled during a recovery phase at the beginning of the character's activation. As a reminder, this is handled by rolling a d6, and on a 4 or better, stunned is removed. If stunned was caused by a spell, it will of course only last as long as the spell does. Frightened has the same effects as stunned, except the character can run. Additionally, all courage tests against fearsome enemies, such as the skeleton, will be automatically failed. Frightened, unless otherwise indicated, lasts until the beginning of the character's next activation. Diseased has the same effects as stunned, but its duration is it remains until after the quest is over. As a general rule, only potions, healing spells, or healers can remove this condition. Now, we've mentioned stationary numerous times throughout this video. This token represents the stationary condition. Characters under this condition cannot be activated. They are automatically hit by melee weapons and are an easy target for ranged shots. They cannot dispel, and they have no melee range. Unless otherwise specified, this will last until the beginning of the character's next activation or until they're hit by an enemy attack. When a character only has 1 vitality left, he will be considered wounded. The exception is with a huge creature, it will be regarded as wounded when it has less than 5 vitality points remaining. This has the same effect as stunned, and it is only removed if the character recovers at least 1 vitality point or has more than 5 for a huge creature. Poisoned has the same effect as stunned, and it lasts until the quest is over. As a general rule, only potions or healing spells can remove this condition. When a character suffers multiple conditions, their effects are cumulative. So in this case, they would have a -2 penalty to all of their attributes, again, other than natural armor, mana, and vitality. When a character has accumulated at least as many wounds as they have vitality, they are automatically knocked out. The effect of being knocked out is that all previous conditions are canceled. If they're a hero, they will lie face down, and they can do nothing else during the rest of this game. If this is a character or creature controlled by the dark player, such as a mercenary or an animal, it will be removed from the game. In the case of a hero, at the end of the quest, they will roll 1d6 and check the table for the consequences of being knocked out on page 44. In the case of a 2, they are injured. Now, this assumes that the other heroes were able to recover the body of their knocked out friend before leaving the scenario. Characters can carry the body of a knocked out ally. In order to do so, they must get adjacent to the fallen ally and then use an action to transport him. Characters carrying a knocked out ally can move a number of squares equal to their strength attribute, so in this case, 3. Characters cannot carry allies larger than themselves unless there are 2 adjacent characters, and then they can join their efforts and actions to do so. In that case, they are able to move as many squares as the strength of the strongest character. In order to perform jumps while carrying a fallen ally, they must perform a strength test and an agility test. It's important to try to recover the body of their knocked out friend before they leave the scenario, because if they are not able to, then the knocked out hero's d6 roll becomes more dangerous. Finally, let's discuss shields. Now, as a reminder, shield benefits are lost if the bearer has been attacked from behind or if they're knocked down. Characters wearing a shield can choose whether or not they want to use it. Characters wearing a shield can always choose whether or not they actually want to use it. Most shields stun the opponent if the defender gets double crits when defending. Shields also break the tie in favor of the defender when both fighters get the same result after modifiers and both have the same agility. If a defender using a shield wins the opposed combat roll, they may push equal size or smaller adjacent enemies. When a character is attacked, they may declare they will try to use their shield to block the attack. During that turn, they can re-roll all rolls used to block hits with the shield, but during their next activation, they won't be able to attack or run. A defender may try to block any melee or ranged attacks against him. In order to block a hit, the defender will roll 1d6 and must get a result equal to or greater than the shield's blocking ability, in this case, 5+. The hit will not damage them. Also, blocking with a shield does not prevent any potential knockdown condition the hit might cause. Also, an attacker's critical result will reduce a shield's blocking roll, which means that in this case, in order to block with this shield, they would actually have to roll a 6. If the attacker rolls double crits, then the attack is unblockable. For the purposes of magic projectiles, breath, and aura attacks, the shield does not completely block them, but gives the same benefits as light cover. A defender who uses their shield and blunders will lose the shield in the same way as if it were a weapon, and they will have to make a breaking roll using this stat here. Breaking rolls can also occur when the defender is the target of a magic projectile or a impact from a weapon capable of breaking shields. In those cases, the bearer of the shield must make a breaking roll to determine if the shield breaks or resists the impact. If a shield is broken after blocking a hit, the bearer will automatically take 1 damage die. And that is part 4 of our Dungeon Universalis instructional series. Be sure to come back for our next part, part 5, where we will cover the Dark Player. Be sure to come back and see how to play Kingdom Death Monsters Gambler's Chest Expansion Part 5 coming up very soon. And we've got other great stuff coming up, such as how to play Worms, the board game, how to play Starship Interstellar, just tons and tons of great stuff on the way for the channel. And until next time, if you're bored online, bored offline.